Number 10. The Green Sahara, the Lost World, beneath the desert. Today, the Sahara is imagined as emptiness, an ocean of sand, rock, blazing light, and horizons so harsh that life seems almost impossible. It feels like the kind of place that existed outside history, a natural barrier separating worlds rather than a world of its own. But that image is one of the greatest illusions in ancient history. Thousands of years ago, large parts of the Sahara were not a dead desert at all. They were green. Lakes spread across basins now filled with dust. Rivers crossed land that is now dry beyond imagination. Grasslands supported herds of animals. Hunters, fishers, and cattle herders moved through a landscape full of water, movement, ritual, and life. Beneath the modern desert lies the memory of a lost world so different from the Sahara, we know that it feels almost impossible. But this period is often called the African humid phase, a span of time after the last ice age when changes in climate shifted the rains far northward. Monsoons reached deep into regions that are now among the driest on Earth. The result was not just a slightly wetter desert, but a transformed continent. Places now known for dunes once held lakes large enough to sustain fish and hippos. Crocodiles swam in waters that no longer exist. Human communities camped beside shorelines long vanished. They hunted, gathered, fished, made tools, buried their dead, decorated stone, and eventually raised cattle in a landscape that looked more like savanna than desert. What makes the Green Sahara so haunting is that its evidence survives only in fragments scattered across an environment that later tried to erase it. There is rock art showing giraffes, cattle, swimmers, and scenes of human life in places where no such creatures could survive today. There are ancient lakebeds hidden under sand. There are graves, tools, hearths, and traces of settlements found in regions now nearly uninhabitable. Each fragment carries the same unsettling message. The emptiness came later. The desert we see now is not timeless. It is the aftermath of a world that collapsed. That collapse may have been slow in some places and devastatingly abrupt in others. As Earth's climate shifted again, the rains weakened, lakes shrank, rivers failed, grasslands retreated. What had been habitable began to dry, crack, and harden. Communities that depended on fishing, herding, and seasonal water had to adapt, move, or disappear. Some populations likely drifted toward the Nile Valley, the Sahel, and other refuges where water still remained. In that sense, the Green Sahara may not only be a lost world, it may be one of the great engines of later history, helping push people, animals, and ideas into regions where new forms of civilization would emerge. That possibility is what breaks the timeline in such a disturbing way. We often imagine civilization beginning in narrow, famous corridors such as the Nile or Mesopotamia, as if surrounding landscapes were empty until history started. But the Green Sahara suggests that vast regions of North Africa were already full of human life, mobility, symbolism, and adaptation before the desert turned them into silence. The story of early Africa is not simply a river story. It is also a vanished grassland story, a lake story, a migration story, and a climate story. That entire human worlds may have flourished where almost no one expects them today. The rock art is especially powerful because it feels like a voice trapped on stone. In caves and shelters across the Sahara, people left images of animals, bodies, herds, rituals, and scenes that still resist full explanation. Some seem ordinary, others feel ceremonial or dreamlike. Together they suggest not just survival, but imagination. These were not people passing through an empty wasteland. They belonged to a living landscape filled with meaning. And then the land changed so dramatically that later generations could look at those images and scarcely believe the environment they described had ever existed. That is why the Green Sahara belongs among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. It is a lost world buried not by one city's collapse, but by climate itself. No army destroyed it. No single empire conquered it. The sky withdrew its rain, the lakes died, the grass vanished, and a living human landscape was turned into desert memory. What remains is scattered beneath dunes, preserved in dry basins, and painted on rock walls, under a sun that now punishes the very places where water once gathered. The Sahara feels eternal when you look at it. But under that illusion lies one of the most dramatic disappearances in human history. An entire green world swallowed by sand and almost erased from memory. Number 9, the lost cities of the Amazon, the jungle-urban world. No one expected. For centuries, the Amazon was described by outsiders as a vast green emptiness. A wilderness too dense, too wet, and too difficult to support large societies. Explorers saw trees stretching beyond the horizon and assumed that what they could not see did not exist. The old story said the rainforest was mostly untouched before modern contact, home only to scattered small groups living lightly among rivers and trees. But the jungle was hiding something. Beneath the canopy, under roots, soil, and centuries of growth, archaeologists began finding traces of earthworks, roads, canals, ditches, raised fields, villages, plazas, and managed landscapes. The Amazon was not empty. It had been covering a lost human world. What makes the lost cities of the Amazon so powerful is that they do not look like the ruins people expect. There are no pyramids rising above the treetops, no stone palaces like the Andes, no carved royal inscriptions waiting to be translated. Much of Amazonian civilization was built from earth, wood, fiber, clay, and living forest. Those materials decay, burn, flood, and disappear. After abandonment, jungle growth can swallow an entire settlement until it looks like ordinary terrain. A mound becomes a hill, a road becomes a line of trees. A canal becomes a wet depression. For generations, the forest hid architecture by becoming architecture's grave. Modern archaeology changed the picture. Remote sensing, LiDAR, satellite imagery, and excavation have revealed patterns beneath the canopy. OP. In parts of the Amazon basin, researchers have identified geometric earthworks, causeways, defensive ditches, managed forest islands, and planned communities. Some areas show evidence of large populations altering the landscape over long periods. The rainforest was not always a place humans merely adapted to. In some regions, people shaped it, planted it, managed it, and turned it into a living system that fed society without looking like the fields Europeans expected. That is where the timeline begins to crack. The Amazon was long treated as a barrier to civilization, as if cities required dry stone, open land, and centralized states to be real. But Amazonian societies may have built complexity in a different language. And instead of forcing the forest to become empty farmland, they worked with forest ecology, useful trees, raised fields, river networks, and settlements that blended into the environment. Their world may have been urban without looking like Rome, monumental without stone, and engineered without becoming obvious from the ground. The dark earth known as terra preta adds another layer. Across parts of the Amazon, patches of rich, human-made soil preserve charcoal, pottery, bone, and organic remains, showing that people changed poor tropical soils into fertile ground. This reflects long-term occupation and soil management. In a region where ordinary soils can be difficult for farming, terra preta shows knowledge, patience, and repeated settlement. The disappearance of these worlds was devastating. A disease introduced after European contact may have killed enormous numbers of people before many outsiders ever saw them. Societies collapsed, settlements were abandoned, roads vanished, fields returned to forest. Later visitors entered landscapes already emptied by catastrophe and assumed they were seeing untouched nature. The Amazon looked wild, partly because human worlds had died so completely that the forest had grown over their remains. This is what makes the lost Amazon cities so haunting. They suggest that the greatest ruins of the rainforest may not be buildings, but absences, missing populations, forgotten roads, silent plazas under trees, orchards mistaken for wilderness, earthworks that only reveal themselves from the air. The people who built these worlds left no written histories that outsiders can read. And their descendants still live across the Amazon, but much of the old landscape was broken by conquest, disease, slavery, missions, and land violence. The jungle did not simply hide the past, it helped cover a human disaster. That is why the lost cities of the Amazon belong among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. They prove that civilization does not always announce itself in stone. Sometimes it grows in earthworks, planted forests, dark soils, river routes, and settlements so well adapted to their environment that later eyes mistake them for nature. The Amazon was never just empty green space waiting for history. It was a human landscape filled with memory, labor, design, and loss. Beneath the trees, an entire urban world slept for centuries, and only now are we beginning to understand that the jungle was hiding a civilization shaped like a forest. Number 8. The Tarim Basin mummies, the desert people preserved by sand. In the deserts of western China, along the edges of the Tarim Basin, the sand-preserved people who should have disappeared completely. Their graves lay in one of the driest regions of Central Asia, where wind, salt, cold, and desert conditions protected bodies, clothing, hair, wood, leather, and textiles with unnatural clarity. When archaeologists uncovered the mummies, they were not looking at skeletons reduced to silence. They were looking at faces. Hair still clung to skulls. Clothing still held its shape. Boots, hats, baskets, and grave goods survived beside the dead. The desert had not only buried a lost world, it had paused it. What makes the Tarim Basin mummies so haunting is their location. This Tarim Basin sits at the crossroads of Asia between mountains, deserts, oasis routes, and later Silk Road corridors. It is easy to imagine it as a barren barrier, but in the ancient world, deserts were not only empty spaces. They were dangerous corridors linking distant peoples through oases, river systems, seasonal movement, and trade. The mummies reveal that, long before the famous Silk Road became a name in history books, Central Asia was already a meeting ground of cultures, bodies, technologies, and migrations. Their appearance once shocked early observers because some individuals had clothing, textiles, and physical features that seemed unexpected for the region. But the deeper lesson is not a simple racial mystery. It is that the ancient world was far more connected and mixed than neat maps suggest. The genetic research and archaeology have shown that the Tarim Basin was shaped by complex ancestry and cultural exchange across the Eurasian steppe, mountains, and deserts. The people buried there were not isolated curiosities. They belonged to a world of movement, where ideas, animals, fibers, foods, and technologies traveled across harsh landscapes long before empires controlled the routes. The clothing is especially powerful. Some mummies were buried in woven wool garments, felt hats, leather boots, and textiles that reveal skill, style, and adaptation to a cold desert environment. These were not random scraps. They were crafted objects, made by hands that understood fiber, warmth, movement, and identity. Clothing can tell us what bones cannot. It shows how people faced weather, marked belonging, and carried beauty into death. But in the Tarim graves, the dead did not enter the ground as anonymous bodies. They were dressed as members of a world with taste, technique, and meaning. The cemeteries add another layer of strangeness. Some graves included wooden markers, boat-shaped coffins, cattle-related symbols, and ritual arrangements that still resist full explanation. In a landscape now dominated by dry emptiness, these burial grounds suggest communities with shared beliefs about death and ancestry. The boat-shaped coffins are especially haunting because they appear in the middle of a desert. Were they symbols of travel into another world? Memories of water landscapes that later vanished? Ritual forms carried from elsewhere? The answer remains uncertain, but the image is unforgettable. People buried in boats beneath sand. The Tarim Basin also reminds us that deserts are not always destroyers. Sometimes they are preservers. In wetter climates, bodies rot, textiles decay, wood disappears, and ordinary lives vanish almost completely. In the Tarim Basin, dryness protected what time usually eats. That preservation gives us a rare glimpse of ancient life beyond stone monuments and royal inscriptions. We see hair, shoes, woven cloth, skin, faces, and objects used close to the body. The past becomes intimate. It looks back not as a ruin, but as a person. Their world eventually changed. Water systems shifted, oasis settlements rose and fell, trade routes moved, and later, peoples entered the basin. Languages changed, empires arrived, the dead remained under sand, while new histories passed above them. The cultures that made those early cemeteries did not become famous like Rome, Han China, Persia, or later Silk Road kingdoms. They were absorbed into the larger story of Central Asia, and that is why the Tarim Basin mummies belong among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. They show that the desert did not only erase life, it preserved a crossroads older than the histories that later claimed the region. Beneath the dunes of western China, people slept in wool, leather, wood, and silence, carrying evidence of migration, ritual, climate, and exchange. The sand kept what memory lost, and when the mummies returned, they revealed a truth the old maps never fully admitted. The ancient world was moving through the desert long before the Silk Road had a name. Number 7. Heracleion, the Egyptian port, swallowed by the sea. Off the coast of Egypt, beneath the waters of Abu Qir, a city once thought almost legendary, waited in darkness for more than 1,000 years. Ancient texts mentioned a port called Heracleion, also known as Thonis, a gateway into Egypt where ships, merchants, priests, officials, pilgrims, soldiers, and foreign envoys passed between the Mediterranean and the Nile. For a long time, it existed more as a name than a place, a memory scattered through Greek and Egyptian sources. Then divers found its remains under the sea, giant statues, temple stones, ships, anchors, inscriptions, coins, ritual objects, and fragments of a city that had not vanished from history because it was imaginary. It had vanished because the sea had taken it. And what makes Heracleion so haunting is that it was not a minor settlement lost at the edge of the world. It was once a major port, a threshold between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean. Before Alexandria rose to dominate the coastline, Heracleion received ships carrying goods, people, taxes, offerings, and news from distant lands. The city stood in a watery world of canals, harbours, temples, and trade routes. It was a place where Egyptian religion and foreign commerce met, where stone gods watched over ships, where royal power and maritime wealth passed through the same channels. To lose such a city was not to lose a village. It was to lose a gate into Egypt. The ruins under the water feel almost impossible. Colossal statues lie broken on the seabed, faces and bodies half buried in sediment. Temple blocks rest where fish now move through the spaces once crossed by worshippers. The stone inscriptions still carry names and decrees, but the streets around them are gone. Dozens of shipwrecks and anchors reveal the density of ancient traffic. This was not one sudden wreck. This was an entire port landscape drowned and sealed beneath silt, as if a living city had been turned into an underwater archive. The destruction came from the ground itself. Heracleion was built on unstable coastal land, where water, clay, sand, and human construction created a fragile foundation. Earthquakes, rising seas, floods, and soil liquefaction may have combined over time to weaken and sink the city. The land did not need to explode dramatically to destroy it. It softened, it shifted, it failed. Buildings cracked, streets sank, harbour structures disappeared. The sea entered slowly or violently, but once it claimed the city, the process was irreversible. A place built to control water became a victim of water. That is what makes Heracleion such a powerful lost world. It shows that civilization can be undone not only by war or invasion, but by geography turning against itself. Ports are built because water brings wealth. Water brings trade, fish, movement, taxes, and contact with distant worlds. But the same water can erase everything. Heracleion's strength was also its weakness. Its canals and harbours connected it to the world, then helped turn it into a submerged ruin. The city was not buried under sand like a desert settlement. It was buried under the element that had made it powerful. The underwater discoveries also reveal how much coastal history may be missing. Ancient ports were often built where rivers met seas, precisely in places most vulnerable to subsidence, storms, floods, and sea level change. And if Heracleion could disappear so completely that it became nearly mythical, how many other coastal cities, shrines, markets, and harbours have been lost beneath sediment and waves? The sea does not preserve history in the same way dry desert does. It breaks, shifts, scatters, and hides. But sometimes it also protects, covering monuments from later looting and keeping them in darkness until divers arrive centuries later. Heracleon's return is strange because the city came back without sound. The market noise is gone, the prayers are gone, the ship crews are gone, the officials collecting customs, the priests carrying offerings, the merchants waiting for permission to enter Egypt, all are gone. Only stone remains, and stone underwater feels more silent than stone on land. A statue under the sea is not just a ruin, it is a witness trapped in a world where human breath cannot remain. That is why Heracleion belongs among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. It was a real city, a sacred port, a commercial gateway, and a living edge of ancient Egypt. Then the ground failed, the water rose, and the city slipped below the surface until its name became almost a ghost. Beneath the Mediterranean, Heracleion still lies among silt, statues, anchors, and broken temple stones, reminding us that some civilizations do not disappear upward into myth. They sink downward into silence. And sometimes the sea remembers what history forgot. Number 6. The Lost Kingdom of Aksum's Buried Cities. In the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea, above the Red Sea trade routes, there was once a kingdom powerful enough to stand among the great civilizations of the ancient world. Aksum minted coins, raised towering stone stelae, controlled trade routes, built monuments, adopted Christianity early, and connected Africa, Arabia, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean into one network of wealth and belief. Yet for many people today, Aksum feels strangely distant, almost absent from the popular map of ancient history. Egypt is remembered, Rome is remembered, Persia is remembered. But the world of Aksum, one of Africa's great ancient powers, remains partly buried under soil, stone, churches, farms, and silence. What makes Aksum so powerful is that it was never just one city, that it was a wider world of settlements, tombs, palaces, roads, fields, inscriptions, religious centers, and trade connections spread across a rugged landscape. The famous stelae are only the most visible survivors. Buried structures, carved platforms, old churches, water systems, and settlement mounds hint at a kingdom whose true size and complexity may still be hidden below the surface. Aksum was not a lonely monument field. It was an urban and sacred landscape. Its wealth came from position. Aksum stood close enough to the Red Sea to control movement between the African interior and the wider world. Ivory, gold, incense, animal products, grain, metals, and luxury goods moved through its networks. Ships crossed to Arabia and beyond. Roman and Byzantine worlds knew its power. The coins bearing Aksumite rulers travelled far from the highlands, proving that this kingdom participated in a global economy before the modern world had any right to imagine Africa as isolated. Aksum was a hinge between continents. The stelae themselves feel like stone versions of buried memory. Some rise like towers from the ground, carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and window-like designs. They marked elite tombs and transformed death into architecture. To stand before them is to feel that the dead were not simply hidden below the earth. They were announced to the sky. But many of the tombs beneath or near these monuments were disturbed, looted, damaged, or only partly understood. Aksum also breaks the narrow way ancient civilization is often taught, and the usual story moves from Mesopotamia to Egypt, Greece, Rome, and then Europe, as if power and urban life flowed in one direction. Aksum proves that ancient Africa held states deeply connected to world history on their own terms. It minted its own money, carved its own inscriptions, shaped its own monuments, and developed its own religious and political identity. Its civilization was both African and international, local and global, rooted in highland landscapes while reaching across seas. Then its world changed. Trade routes shifted. Environmental pressures may have altered agriculture and settlement. Regional powers rose and fell. Red Sea commerce transformed. Political centers moved. Some Aksumite cities declined, others changed, and the kingdom's old urban geography became harder to see. Unlike a city destroyed in one dramatic fire, Aksum's lost world faded in layers. Buildings collapsed. Sites were reused, sacred places were rebuilt, fields covered old foundations, villages grew near ancient stones. The past did not vanish completely, but it became folded into the living landscape. That is what makes Aksum's buried cities so haunting. They are not lost because no one lives near them. They are lost because too much remains beneath the surface, because the visible monuments are only fragments, and because the world has often failed to place Aksum where it belongs in the story of civilization. Some lost worlds are hidden by sand or jungle. Aksum is hidden by under-excavated ground, overlooked history, and the shadow of better-known empires. That is why the lost kingdom of Aksum belongs among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. It reminds us that the map of ancient civilization is incomplete when Africa is treated as background. Beneath the highland soil are traces of a kingdom that linked continents, raised stone towers over the dead, sent coins into distant markets, and built a sacred landscape that still has not given up all its secrets. Aksum did not disappear because it was insignificant. It became hidden because history looked elsewhere. And under the fields and stones of the Horn of Africa, one of the ancient world's great powers is still waiting to be fully remembered. Number 5, the Bactria-Margiana oasis world, the civilization in the desert. In the deserts and oases of Central Asia, between the mountains, plains, and ancient trade corridors of what are now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and nearby regions, archaeologists uncovered a civilization that many people had never heard of. It had fortified settlements, monumental buildings, craft workshops, seals, metalwork, ritual spaces, and evidence of far-reaching exchange. Yet it did not become famous like Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, or China. Its name is modern and difficult. The Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, often called BMAC, or the Oxus civilization. But behind that dry label was a lost oasis world, built in places where water meant survival and desert meant death. What makes the Oxus world so haunting is that it rose where most people imagine only emptiness. Central Asia is often remembered as a corridor between greater civilizations, a place crossed by later Silk Road merchants, armies, and nomads. But BMAC suggests that long before those famous routes, the oases themselves held complex societies with their own architecture, rituals, technologies, and power. These were not people merely passing through. They were building fortified centers, controlling water, making luxury goods, and turning small fertile pockets into islands of civilization surrounded by desert. Sites such as Gonur Tepe reveal how elaborate this world could be. Massive walls, planned compounds, ceremonial areas, storage spaces, and craft zones suggest organized communities with authority, labor, and belief systems strong enough to shape entire settlements. The architecture does not look accidental, as it feels controlled, enclosed, and purposeful, as if the people who built it were managing both danger and sacred order. In an oasis environment, walls could protect grain, water, animals, goods, and status. But they could also mark a boundary between ordinary life and ritual power. The artifacts deepen the mystery. Archaeologists have found finely worked metal objects, carved stone vessels, seals, beads, figurines, and materials that suggest contact with distant regions. BMAC sat between major ancient worlds, the Iranian plateau, the Indus region, the steppe, and Mesopotamia. Goods and ideas moved through this zone, but the Oxus people were not simply borrowing from others. They created their own style, their own ritual objects, and their own distinctive material culture. They were part of a connected Bronze Age world that was larger and stranger than the textbook map usually admits. Religion or ritual seems to have played a major role, though its meaning remains difficult to reconstruct. Some spaces have been interpreted as temples or ceremonial complexes. Fire, water, intoxicating substances, animal remains, and unusual vessels have all been discussed in connection with possible rites. There are hints that the Oxus world may have influenced or been connected to later Indo-Iranian religious traditions, but the evidence remains debated. That uncertainty is part of the fascination. The site gives us ritual architecture and symbolic objects, but no readable scripture. It gives us sacred spaces without the prayers once spoken inside them. The desert setting also makes the civilization feel fragile. An oasis world depends on water management, climate stability, trade routes, and the ability to maintain life in a harsh environment. And if rivers shifted, if soils became exhausted, if political networks broke, or if trade patterns changed, the system could weaken quickly. A city in a river valley may expand outward. An oasis city is surrounded by limits. Its survival is always negotiated with thirst. BM. AC's decline may have involved environmental change, migration, social transformation, or absorption into later cultures. But no single simple ending explains it fully. That is why the Bactria-Margiana oasis world belongs among the lost worlds, buried under sand, jungle, and sea. It shows that ancient civilization was not limited to the famous river valleys. In Central Asia, people built a complex Bronze Age society from water pockets in the desert, linking distant worlds while maintaining their own identity. And then that world faded, its walls broken, its rituals silenced, its name forgotten until archaeology pulled it from the dust. The Oxus civilization reminds us that some lost worlds were not at the edges of history. They were at the crossroads. And sometimes the crossroads themselves are buried so completely that the world forgets they ever existed. Number 4. The hidden Maya cities under the jungle canopy. For centuries, the Maya ruins that rose above the jungle seemed impressive enough on their own. Pyramids, temples, carved stones, palace platforms and plazas standing like islands of masonry in a sea of green. But those visible ruins were only the surface. The rainforest of Mesoamerica had been hiding something much larger. Under the canopy, beneath roots, soil, and dense vegetation, there were roads, terraces, platforms, reservoirs, walls, causeways, neighborhoods, and entire urban networks that could not be understood from the ground. The jungle did not simply cover a few abandoned temples, it covered a civilization-scale landscape. What changed the story was LiDAR, a scanning technology that can see through forest canopy by mapping the shape of the ground beneath leaves and branches. When researchers applied it to parts of the Maya lowlands, the old image of scattered ceremonial centers began to collapse. The scans revealed thousands of structures, raised roads, agricultural systems, defensive works, and settlement patterns stretching far beyond the famous monuments. Places that looked like empty rainforest were suddenly filled with architecture. Hills became pyramids. Straight lines became causeways. Slight rises became house platforms. The jungle had been disguising cities as nature. This is what makes the hidden Maya world so haunting. The Maya were already known as one of the great civilizations of the ancient Americas, but the scale revealed under the canopy suggests even greater density, planning, and environmental management than many outsiders imagined. These were not isolated temple complexes surrounded by empty green space, and in many regions, they were parts of connected landscapes, with people moving along raised roads, farming modified land, storing water, living in neighborhoods, and linking city centers through systems of movement and obligation. The forest hid not only buildings, but the structure of daily life. Water made this world especially complex. In the Maya lowlands, survival depended on managing seasonal rainfall, reservoirs, wetlands, and soil. The hidden landscape includes evidence of canals, terraces, field systems, and water control features that show long-term adaptation to a difficult environment. The Maya did not simply live in the rainforest, they engineered parts of it. They shaped water, earth, and settlement into a system that could support large populations in places where modern eyes once saw only wilderness. That achievement is easy to miss because tropical architecture often disappears faster than desert stone. The jungle also changed how collapse was understood. For a long time, people imagined Maya cities as isolated monuments that were suddenly abandoned. But when the broader landscape appears, the collapse becomes more disturbing. It was not only palaces and temples that emptied, it was a web of farms, roads, reservoirs, houses, markets, and sacred centers. If drought, warfare, political breakdown, overuse of land, shifting trade, or social unrest struck this system, the consequences would not be confined to one city. They would move through the network, a reservoir failing, a road becoming unsafe, a ruling house losing legitimacy, a field system breaking down. Each could weaken the world around it. Yet the word lost can be misleading. The Maya did not vanish. Millions of Maya people still live today, speaking Maya languages, preserving traditions, and carrying identity through centuries of conquest and pressure. What was lost was not the people themselves, but many of the ancient urban landscapes beneath the forest, and many of the written, political, and architectural systems that once tied those landscapes together. The jungle covered the stones, while colonial history tried to cover the voices. Both forms of erasure matter. That is why the hidden Maya cities belong among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. They show that one of the greatest urban landscapes in the ancient Americas was larger, denser, and more connected than the visible ruins suggested. The rainforest did not preserve the past neatly. It wrapped it in roots, broke it with water, and made it almost invisible until technology learned how to read the ground beneath the trees. Under the canopy, the Maya world is still there. Roads without footsteps, reservoirs without voices, platforms under leaves, and cities that remind us the jungle was never empty. It was hiding history in plain sight. Number 3. The Taklamakan Desert cities, the Silk Road worlds, buried by sand. In western China, the Taklamakan Desert stretches like a warning across the Tarim Basin, a place ancient travelers feared as a sea of death. Its dunes, wind, salt flats, and dry riverbeds could erase roads, bury houses, and swallow entire settlements. Yet along its edges, where rivers from distant mountains fed narrow strips of life, oasis cities once rose from the desert. These places became part of the ancient Silk Road world, stations of trade, religion, language, and survival. Then the rivers shifted, the routes changed, and the sand began its slow work. Cities that once connected empires disappeared beneath dunes. Names like Lulan, Nia, Miran, and Dandan Oilik sound almost like legends now, but they were real places where people lived between the desert and the mountains. And they built houses from wood, reed, clay, and earth. They grew crops where water allowed it. They traded silk, wool, jade, documents, coins, food, and ideas across distances that linked China, India, Persia, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Monks, merchants, soldiers, officials, and caravan drivers passed through these oasis worlds. The desert was not empty. It was dangerous, but it was also a corridor. Civilization moved along its edges like fire along a fuse. What makes the Taklamakan cities so haunting is how well the desert preserved what it destroyed. In wetter places, wood rots, paper dissolves, cloth decays, and ordinary objects vanish. In the dry sands of the Tarim Basin, fragile materials survived with impossible clarity. Archaeologists found wooden tablets, textiles, documents, wall paintings, Buddhist images, records, and even bodies preserved by dryness. The sand did not keep only palaces and temples. It kept the texture of daily life: letters, shoes, tools, beams, food remains, and small human traces that stone cities often lose. At Nia, documents written on wooden tablets revealed administration, law, taxes, property, and everyday disputes from a society that once stood in the desert corridor. These were bureaucratic worlds with names, obligations, seals, and messages. At Lulan, the remains of a once important settlement showed how fragile oasis life could be when water systems changed. At Myron and other sites, Buddhist art and architecture revealed the spread of religion across the desert routes. Each buried town shows the same truth. The Silk Road was not one road. It was a chain of worlds, each dependent on water, trade, and political connection. But oasis civilizations are vulnerable in a way stone capitals sometimes are not, and their survival depends on rivers that can move, shrink, or dry. A changing climate, irrigation, war, or trade routes can turn a living settlement into a doomed one. If the river shifts away, fields fail. If caravans choose another route, markets empty. If political protection collapses, travel becomes dangerous. In the Taklamakan, a city could die not because it was conquered, but because the landscape stopped cooperating. Once people left, the desert quickly began covering walls, wells, shrines, and streets. That is why these ruins feel different. They are not only places where people left, they are places the earth took back. Sand entered rooms, dunes climbed over roofs, and wind erased paths. A temple could become a mound. A house could disappear so completely that only a beam or tablet remained under the surface. The desert became both murderer and archivist, burying the cities while preserving the evidence of who had lived there. The lost Taklamakan cities also remind us that civilization was not confined to the famous centers of empire. Some of history's most important work happened in the spaces between empires, where languages met, religions traveled, and merchants carried goods and stories. These oasis towns were fragile, but they were not peripheral. They were joints of the ancient world. Without them, Silk Road networks could not breathe. That is why the Taklamakan Desert cities belong among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. They show that the desert did not simply separate civilizations. It hosted them, connected them, preserved them, and then swallowed them. Beneath the dunes of the Tarim Basin lie houses where people once argued over property, temples where monks painted sacred images, caravan streets, and records left by hands that never imagined the sand would become their archive. The Taklamakan looks empty from the surface, but under the dunes, the Silk Road is still buried, waiting in fragments for the wind to uncover another lost world. Number 2. Nan Madol, the stone city built on a lagoon. In the western Pacific, off the island of Pohnpei, there is a ruined city that does not seem to belong where it is. Nan Madol rises from a shallow lagoon as a maze of artificial islets, canals, seawalls, tombs, platforms, and massive basalt walls built directly over coral reef. From above, it looks like a stone city floating between land and sea, a place neither fully island nor fully ocean. For centuries, it has been surrounded by stories, royal memory, sacred power, and unanswered engineering questions. It was not swallowed completely by the sea, but it was built so close to water that the lagoon itself became part of its architecture. What makes Nan Madol so haunting is the material. Its walls were built from long columns of basalt, stacked like dark logs of volcanic stone. Some are heavy enough to make their movement difficult to explain even today. The stone did not come ready-made to the reef. It had to be quarried, transported, lifted, and placed across water and unstable ground. The builders had no modern machines, no steel cranes, no written engineering manuals. Yet they created a monumental complex of stone and canals in one of the most remote parts of the Pacific. The result feels less like an ordinary settlement and more like a sacred machine built on the edge of the ocean. Nan Madol was connected to the Saudeleur dynasty, the ruling line that once controlled Pompeii. The site may have served as a political, ritual, and elite center, where rulers, priests, attendants, and sacred dead were separated from ordinary life. Its islets were not all the same. Some appear linked to residences, ceremonies, food preparation, tombs, or ritual functions. The most famous area, with towering walls and royal mortuary structures, gives the feeling of a city built not for crowds, but for authority and death. It was a capital, but not like a normal capital. It was a controlled world of stone corridors, water channels, and sacred isolation. The canals are what make the city feel truly strange. Instead of streets, water moved between the islets. Canoes could pass through channels where people once carried food, offerings, bodies, messages, and royal commands. The city was organized by water as much as stone. In many civilizations, water is a boundary outside the city. At Nan Madol, water was inside the city, dividing space, shaping movement, and giving the complex its eerie, floating character. That is why some outsiders called it the Venice of the Pacific, but the comparison is too easy. Venice was a merchant republic. The Nan Madol was a sacred oceanic power center with a different logic entirely. Its location also breaks the usual map of ancient civilization. Many people imagine monumental architecture as something that belongs to continents, river valleys, and agricultural states. Nan Madol proves that Pacific societies could create monumental landscapes using maritime knowledge, oral tradition, social organization, and labor systems adapted to islands. The Pacific was not empty water between real civilizations. It was a world of navigation, genealogy, ritual power, ecological knowledge, and island networks. Nan Madol stands as stone evidence that oceanic civilization had its own forms of grandeur. Then the world of Nan Madol declined. The Saudaleur order fell, local political systems changed, and the city gradually lost its central role. Its walls remained, but daily life withdrew. The vegetation grew over stones, canals silted, sacred places became ruins. Oral traditions preserved memories of tyranny, magic, construction, and overthrow. But the full political history of the site remains difficult to reconstruct. The city did not disappear under dunes or vanish beneath jungle completely. It lingered in a half-lost state, visible yet mysterious, known to local memory but still resistant to outside explanation. That is why Nan Madol belongs among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. It was not buried in the usual way. It was buried in water, mangrove, coral, oral memory, and the silence left when its ruling world collapsed. Its basalt walls still rise from the lagoon, but they no longer speak the language of the people who built them. We can see the stones, measure the islets, map the canals, and still not fully understand the belief system that made such a city necessary. Nan Madol reminds us that lost worlds do not have to be hidden deep underground to be forgotten. Sometimes they stand in plain sight, surrounded by water, too strange for the outside world to fit into its usual timeline. In the lagoon of Pompeii, the stones remain stacked above the tide, dark and heavy, like a city built for rulers, spirits, and the dead. The ocean has not erased Nan Madol. It has kept it suspended between memory and mystery. Number 1. The Indus Valley cities, the civilization buried without a deciphered voice. In the plains of South Asia, along the old river systems of what are now Pakistan and northwest India, one of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world rose, flourished, and then fell into silence. Its cities were enormous. Its streets were planned. Its houses were built from standardized bricks. Its drains ran beneath roads. Its wells, baths, workshops, seals, weights, and trade goods reveal a society organized on a scale that rivals Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet unlike those civilizations, the Indus Valley still refuses to speak. Its script remains undeciphered. Its kings, if it had kings, are unnamed. Its gods, laws, stories, and political system remain locked behind symbols no one can read. That is what makes the Indus Valley so haunting. The Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dolavira, Rakigahi, and many other sites, show that this was not one isolated city, but a vast urban world spread across an immense region. It traded over long distances, connected river plains to deserts and seas, and maintained patterns of craft, measurement, and city planning across hundreds of kilometers. This was civilization in every material sense. But because its writing has not been translated, it exists like a city behind glass. We can see its shape, we can walk through its streets, we can measure its bricks, but we cannot hear its voice. The planning is especially unsettling because it feels so modern. At Mohenjo-Daro, streets were laid out in grids, houses opened into lanes, wells provided water, drains carried waste away from living spaces. The Great Bath suggests ritual, public gathering, purification, or power expressed through water. The city was designed with order, sanitation, and urban management in mind, yet there is no obvious palace towering over everything, no monumental royal tomb, no giant statue of a ruler, no military art glorifying conquest. The Indus cities seem organized, but the nature of that organization remains mysterious. This is one reason the civilization breaks the usual timeline of power. Many early states announce themselves through kings, war, temples, and inscriptions. The Indus Valley does not fit that pattern neatly. Its authority may have been more distributed, more corporate, more ritualized, or expressed in ways archaeology has not learned to recognize. Standardized weights and bricks suggest coordination. Urban planning suggests governance. Trade seals suggest administration. But the absence of readable texts leaves the structure invisible. We know there was order, yet we do not know who held it. The seals are among the most famous objects from the Indus world. They show animals, human-like figures, composite beings, and short lines of script. Bulls, unicorn-like creatures, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, and other symbols appear again and again. Were these clan signs, trademarks, religious images, administrative labels, names, titles, or something else entirely? The symbols look meaningful, but their meaning remains unreachable. Each seal feels like a message from a civilization that wrote in fragments and never left a key. Then the cities declined. The collapse was not one dramatic disaster that can be explained in a single sentence. Climate shifts, changing river systems, weakening monsoons, trade disruption, migration, and social transformation may all have played roles. Some great urban centers were abandoned or reduced. The populations moved east and south, the city-based world transformed into smaller regional cultures. There is no known final battle, no last king, no text mourning the fall. The civilization did not vanish in one night. It dissolved across landscapes, leaving bricks, drains, seals, and unanswered questions behind. That is why the Indus Valley cities belong at number one among the lost worlds buried under sand, jungle, and sea. They represent a civilization enormous enough to stand beside Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet silent enough to feel almost ghost-like. The cities were buried by earth, river change, time, and later settlement, but the deeper burial is linguistic. Until the script is understood, the Indus people remain trapped behind their own symbols. We can admire their engineering, map their streets, study their trade, and hold their seals, but we still cannot ask them who they were. But the most unsettling part is that the Indus Valley is not lost because it was small or fragile. It is lost because one of the greatest urban worlds of antiquity left behind a voice we cannot yet hear. Beneath the plains of South Asia, its cities remain as evidence of a civilization that mastered order, water, craft, and scale without revealing the names of those who built it. The sand and soil covered its streets, time scattered its people, and its script still stands like a locked door at the end of the ancient world.